Morning, everybody. I think we'll probably make a start now, but just recognise that some people are going to be coming along from coffee as we start, but that's absolutely fine. So thanks for joining us here to talk about the potential benefits from in terms of the transition to net zero. My name is Simon Pringle. I do a number of different things. In my day job, I'm a professor of sustainability and innovation at the University of Edinburgh Business School, and I've been working in energy and environment and social impact for nearly 30 years now. But in this guise, I'm just a member of Gracious Street and a member of the district, and I've been supporting the district on the mapping a transition to net zero and seeing how we can enable that to the fullest extent and to benefit both our churches, our communities, and of course the wider communities that we serve and live within as part of that transition. And back in 2019, the Methodist Church declared a climate emergency, as did many of the other faith groups around the UK and other organisations. And off the back of that, I did a piece of work to really start modelling where we were from a carbon point of view across the district, across all, well, a representative sample of the 220 churches and buildings that we have. So I'll touch on that briefly a little bit later on. Then you're going to be hearing from Adele, who is fundraising enabler and has been a real driving force behind some of the pilot work that we've been doing, and Geoff from D3, who some of you will have met already, and he and his colleagues have a stall downstairs, so feel free to go and ask additional questions later and explore what they've been doing elsewhere around not just the district, around the country as well, across this agenda and others. But what I thought I'd do, because we can't take for granted that people actually understand what sits behind this climate crisis, what the science is telling us, why we're responding in the way we are, and thinking back to what we heard this morning for those of you that were in the sessions in the main hall, why climate change translates so rapidly into issues of social equity and justice, and why it is, for me, fundamental to our faith in terms of not just being stewards of the created earth, but also extending out the hand of love to others who are weaker or more likely to be impacted negatively by the challenges that climate change is creating directly and driving. So I'm going to put my professorial hat on briefly and just go through some really basic slides just to give you a little bit of background. So I'm not going to try and teach you all a science lesson here, but I think it's important we're all on the same page before we start talking a little bit about what we're doing in practice, if that's okay. So bear with me on that one. You'll also see me looking at my phone and scrolling it. It's not because I'm just checking Twitter or doom scrolling, to use the phrase that was used earlier on. It's because I can't see the screens, right? And so I've got my slides here on my phone, and Adele very sensibly printed hers out. I didn't do that. That's my confession for the morning. They're here on my phone. But if we go to the first slide, please. It's all going to be a little bit Chris Whitty as well, because we're going to be next slide pleasing. So you should hopefully be there looking at a large colourful table, and this was produced this year, in January of this year, and it comes from something called the World Economic Forum. You might know it better as Davos if people have sort of picked that up through the news, and it's published every year. And what this represents is an economist's eye view. So this is not environmentalists or lobbyists or activists. These are the economists across various global settings, and it's their view on the most significant risks that are likely to address us societally, globally, within the next 2 years and within 10 years. And what you'll note there, if we were looking at the equivalent one of this back in 2008, 29, something like that, all of the top ones would have been economic, that have been around banking crises and cash flow and all the rest of it. Red is social, green is environmentally related. And what they're saying is, yes, right at the top of the list there is the cost of living crisis. So we obviously all understand the impact that's having on the societies around us. But then sitting below that, natural disasters and extreme weather events. They're different in different parts of the world, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then the failure to mitigate climate change and so on, which is essentially a political willingness thing, because we know what we need to do. The biggest barrier to addressing the climate crisis is actually sitting between our ears, really, in terms of our willingness to change and adapt and understand this. But if we look in 10 years' time, the Economist view is that all of the top six are environmental and social. Failure to mitigate climate change, which is to do anything about it. Failure to adapt to climate change, which is actually to change the way in which we're operating, change business models, change the way we build buildings and infrastructure and so on. Natural disasters, biodiversity, and linked to that, large-scale involuntary migration. So a lot of the themes that were being discussed earlier, for me, just stand out from that. It might feel like we can't do very much, or it's very, very local to us in terms of our church, our patch, but this is a global challenge of profound significance, and it will have not just environmental consequences, but truly significant social consequences that will impact upon those who are least well equipped to deal with it first and hardest. So, if we go to the next slide, it will get more cheerful, by the way. Just not my bit, right? So I'm going to do the misery bit first, and it's going to get much more positive over here, I promise you. So we go to the next one. Some of you might have seen this. It's a little bit old. I quite like it because it's very visual. Hopefully you're looking at the front cover of The Economist, and what that is showing is a progression from 1850 through to now-ish, a couple of years ago. And they're called climate stripes, and a very creative individual came up with that way of representing the way that climate has changed. They are the global average temperatures. Now, what you can see, of course, is that, yes, for those of you who are a little bit sort of analytical on these matters, of course, things change year to year to year, but the trend is very, very clear there, isn't it? And it's the acceleration over the last limited number of years that is the most significant and profoundly concerning aspect of this. Because if we go to the next slide, this one is representing the cumulative, that means the total, the aggregate, emission of CO2 over time. And it's dated back to 1751. And there's a reason we do that, because that's just the agreed date for when the Industrial Revolution sort of started. Okay, so we're in very basic Industrial Revolution territory there. We're at Iron Bridge, or the first steps away from essentially agricultural societies. And for the first 100 years or so, essentially nothing really happened. And then there was a bit of a pickup, and it started accelerating to 1950. Now, what I'd encourage you to do in here is to try and work out roughly where your birth date is and plot yourself on that curve. So mine is 1972, I'm 50. And if we look at my birth date, there was around about 600 billion tonnes of CO2 had been emitted prior to me being born. After I was born, I'd like to just say that it wasn't my fault directly. It went up to 1.4 trillion. So more than doubled from when I was born to now in terms of the total amount of CO2 that's been emitted. So the acceleration of that emission of CO2 has never happened before, and it's directly linked to human activity. It's directly linked to the economic choices we've made, to the way in which the economy is globalised and truly globalised, and other drivers in there as well, the energy intensity of the lives that we lead and so on and so forth. But it's gone up very, very sharply. So if we go to the next slide, this is a bit of a complicated one, but I'm going to try and read it properly on my phone. You can see it better than I can. I know roughly what it says. It's explaining where that CO2 has come from. So we know where it's come from. Some of it is directly measured, because we can do that. Others comes from models and extrapolations. But the purple colour at the bottom, if it's coming through like that, that's essentially fossil fuels. So that is coal-fired power stations, road transport, aviation, all that sort of thing. The one sitting above it has got that really rather sort of odd acronym. We do lots of acronyms in climate. This one is LULUCF. And LULUCF is nothing to do with venerable Scottish singers or anything of that nature. It is land use change and forestry, right? So it's the way in which we use landscape. That's what that is. The one above, CH4, for the chemists in the room, that's methane. Now, for those of you that are thinking about farting cows, apologies to the young people in the room, there's a bit of that, but there's also a lot of industrial processes going on there too. Lots of methane emissions come from that. And then we have N2O, which is nitrous oxide, that's cars, that's the next band above, and F gases. And F gases are the things that help us with air conditioning and in fridges and things like that. And they are really very potent climate change enablers, which is why we try and keep them in closed systems rather than letting them leak out. But some of them leak out, and that's what F-gases are. So that's where it's come from. So there's no mystery to this. It's come from that. And so if we go to the next slide, thinking back to that first one, this one's more recent. This is 2005 to more or less now. And this is showing you the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. The first one was the volume, the physical amount that's been released. This is the concentration. So this is where you put probes and measure it. And what you'll see is back in 2005, it was 380 parts per million, which sounds like a tiny, tiny amount. And on one level, it is, but it's more than enough to change the way that our climate system works. And in the 15 years subsequent to that, that's gone up from 380 to 410. Now, there are some people in the room who probably were born within that period towards the front, so there's been a sharp increase in that period. You'll probably also have heard about the Paris Agreement, right? The commitments to limit global warming to under 1.5 degrees. That was signed in 2015. That's right in the middle. So subsequent to the great celebrations around signing that agreement, it's carried on the same trajectory, going up, 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 and it's continuing to do that. So if we go to the next slide, what we know, of course, is that it's heating the world at different rates in different places. And again, that's important because that's the difference between climate and weather, which means you wander out on a summer's day and it's a bit cold and you go, climate change can't be real, can it, because it's chilly here. Well, it's a global system and it impacts in different places, and the alarming thing is that we know that the poles are heating, not people who live in Gdansk, but the poles of the Earth are heating far more quickly than other parts of the world. I'm going to speed up now because I don't want to rob time from these two. Why is that important? Next slide. Because, of course, it's melting the sea ice. And there's that line coming down in the other direction. It's a direct inverse to the one that you're looking at in terms of CO2. And that leads us to this one, which is about tipping points. And this is an amazing slide for me. We are losing on an annual basis the same amount of sea ice that would cover Scotland. Over a decade, the amount of sea ice that's been lost is the same size as the UK, Ireland and France combined. And over the last 40 years, the amount of sea ice that's been lost is the same size as the Indian subcontinent. It's huge. And that is profound because, of course, it links to sea level rise, and it also is a tipping point because it accelerates the way that the world heats itself. And so if we go to the next slide, that then comes through into what I was saying before, all sorts of different impacts. We don't really need to labour the point here. They represent themselves as social impacts as well as environmental ones. And, coming straight through into the lived experience of people all around the world. If we go to the next slide, probably the most sort of profound global ones that we've been seeing recently have been wildfires, Australia, west coast of the United States, and so on. Here in the UK, on the next slide, we're far more likely to experience it through flooding. And almost certainly there'll be people in the room, certainly people at Flourish, who have been personally impacted by flooding. The amount and the rate of flooding that's been going up and up. It just seems to be really now a yearly event. We just have to wait to see whose turn it is next in terms of where the flooding occurs. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to skip past the next slide. So if you could skip over the top of that one, please, and just take me to what happened next in Yorkshire and north and east, that would be great. Is that on the screen now? Yeah. So what we did in terms of the initial piece of work was to take a sample of 39 churches across the 220 and really understand what energy use was like across those. They were representative of different types of setting and different scales of building. And we used the information that we derived from that to map out a potential way forwards, combining energy efficiency, renewable generation, tariff support, and other types of community-based activity that would help us as a district address our own challenges and show some leadership in terms of this critical social event. So what happened next, Adele?
Thank you, Simon. My name's Adele Borrowman, the grant fundraising enabler, and I'm about to tell you what happened next in Yorkshire North and East. So I'm going to start my timer as well to make sure I don't talk too much. First of all, we took the work that Simon and his team had done, knowing the three things about what we needed to do to get to net zero in our district. The three things are, if we're on the next slide of 2020 starting blocks, what we did in 2020 was took these three initiatives: the decarbonisation of our buildings, which we needed to do to achieve net zero, along with switching our tariffs to change our church energy tariffs towards renewable tariffs. And the third thing we were going to have to do to achieve net zero is personal pledges. So look at carbon footprints in our own lives. And how to reduce them. So taking those 3 points forward, we needed to learn about how to do this. There are two next steps. We needed to network with other learners and find out more. And, of course, we needed to find the money to do those things. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to talk about that journey that we've had as a district. And then I will hand on to Geoff, who will be able to explain more about the technical detail. Firstly, networks and learning. Hopefully, next slide. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to go into great detail on the organisations involved, but suffice it to say, it's not just us that are doing this journey. All sorts of organisations have helped us begin to understand what we need to do. And we found the biggest strength is joining up with other groups who are trying to look at net zero and learn with them and alongside them. The one I want to point out is the Church of England and their 100+ webinars. I think if you struggle with insomnia, please don't go to the website, because the webinars are all extremely interesting and really inspiring. So if you want to learn about how a heat pump might work, or solar panels might work for you or not, then go to the Church of England website and get stuck in with the webinars. So next slide, please. I think I'm also aware not many of us are really net zero experts. It's a new field to many of us. So learning has been really important. I don't know about you, but I didn't really understand too much of the language of power or CO2 emissions. So looking at, I know it's an American ton, but similar parallels. What we learned from those church assessments that Simon mentioned earlier, that the average church in the district could stop 8.9 tonnes of CO2 emissions per year by installing some renewable energy measures. So that's 8.9 of these tonnes, very roughly, US tonnes aside, but you get the idea. That's a lot of carbon dioxide and going to have a lot of impact on reducing climate change. And the other thing we struggled to understand was what is a kilowatt hour? What does it actually look like? What does it do? It's all very well to hear about solar panels generating however many kilowatt hours, but what do they actually mean? Well, turning kilowatt hours generated from our solar panels into cups of tea seemed to work for many of us Methodists. So you can find your own measure, but here we've worked out that based on this sample of 36 rural churches, the average church in the district could brew almost 1 million cups of tea by the energy generated from solar panels if they were fitted on their building. When I say almost 1 million, it's quite a round up from 821,000, but you get the idea. I'm open to other ideas about what unit of power would work for you, so come and talk to me afterwards. Next slide on learning and buildings and technology. There's been some lessons along the way. I think you don't progress with change without learning a few things, having some things go well and some things not so well. So here I just wanted to touch on a couple of the commonly referred to measures. I think solar panels, we've learned that really it's great to make friends with your contractor. If you're having solar panels fitted, then just make sure you can work with the contractor you appoint to have those conversations when you're not quite sure if the system's doing what it should, or whether the treasurer suddenly sees your energy bill as spiked. Is it because the inverter's not doing its thing? Whatever it is, if you found a contractor that you feel you can have a good relationship with, then they'll come out and sort you out later on, further down the line. And then things like heat pumps, I think everybody always runs to heat pumps as a magic solution for net zero. We hear a lot about them, but we've discovered it's a long road and it's not the right road for everybody. So what we've learned is that feasibility and looking at the building as a whole is really the most important starting point. So and that can save later on the expense of a heat pump if it's not the right solution. If you've looked at your building as a whole as a feasibility assessment, then you'll know what the right solution is before you need to spend any money on the capital works. So we've also learnt, as I mentioned earlier, talking to others, sharing the journey. We've learnt from other denominations and other community organisations learning, and in turn we're sharing ours. And I think we're not going to pretend net zero is super easy, but by sharing the learning, we'll all go forward faster. Next slide, please. So the question everyone is always keen to hear about is funding. How did we get started with funding net zero in the district? Well, first of all, from one of these friends we made earlier on, the Net Zero Hub in the North East and Yorkshire, affiliated to BEIS, who are now Department of Energy Security, I think, in net zero. We were successful in securing funds for, 2/3 of the district. Unfortunately, the fund ran out before we got to Rydale and North Yorkshire coast, so apologies if you're from that direction. But what the funding there secured was assessments of 36 churches within the district to see how we could decarbonise them and how we could get the building to net zero. And Geoff will talk in more detail about how that was done in a minute. But these three organisations were involved in those projects, and Geoff is here from D3 as one of those. So next slide, please. On the funding side, there are three things we needed beyond that feasibility. Once we'd had these assessments done, we needed to know, we needed to find development costs. That's things like planning permission and the technical workup to find out if a heat pump is suitable for you, that kind of thing. Those technical expenses are called development costs. We also needed capital costs. That's the actual cost of the work on the building. And we also needed to find staff costs. So we need someone to do all the work. So there were three strands. And from that first point of feasibility and those original assessments, funders started to take us seriously that we were already looking at net zero and we knew what we needed. So we were able to find some development costs. This is the hardest area to find funding for. So come and talk to me about that afterwards, by all means. But you can see there are two funders there who've been really helpful. Capital costs, I think those that are always or usually involved in church refurbishments are also interested in your net zero projects. You can see a collection of logos there, I hope, who'll explain, which gives the main funders who've been involved in our capital works. And lastly, staff costs. We're really pleased that the Benefact Trust, in part including Methodist Insurance, now amalgamated into Benefact Trust, have funded a net zero worker. So we'll come on to that in a minute. But those three areas we found funding for. I think next slide, please. I think hopefully the interesting things I can tell you about today are our projects. The first one being T and PV. For some of you that might trip off the tongue, and other people find it a real tongue twister. But Centrica, in the form of the Energy for Tomorrow Fund, have funded us to try solar panels and in some cases batteries and in Hedden's case, an EV charging point, just to try and see what solar looks like in a variety of settings across the district. So we've got some different building types, very different uses and very different communities. And we are going to have solar panels, battery and the EV charger. And on the AV system, we're going to show what's being generated so that it's not just the treasurer that can see if the solar panels are being useful to your billing status, but it's also Cubs, Scouts, Guides, anybody coming into the building, Slimming World, tea and toast, whatever activity happens in your church or in these churches, we're going to be hearing about what the solar generates so that everybody can see. And hopefully that helps with the language of power that we were talking about earlier. We'll all be able to see the benefits of solar PV. So there'll be a range of community events around those installations, featuring cups of tea and experts to talk to. So those installations should go ahead in the next few weeks. So watch out for more information on those. And next slide on South Holderness. Hopefully you can see a slide on the first circuit solar project that we have going on, which is a trio of churches in South Holderness who are going to have solar panels. 2 of them are going to have battery storage. And here the project is about a just transition so that everybody can be part of the transition to net zero. We've got a church in a top 1% of urban deprivation, and then in Hull, and we've got another in splendid rural isolation with no bus route or anything nearby. And right in the middle we have a suburban community hub in the form of Sutton, and together the 3 are going to be able to move towards net zero by lowering their carbon footprint. They're going to have reduced energy bills, which helps keep the churches open, particularly those that are struggling in this time of cost of living crisis and energy crisis. And it's going to show that solar panels can suit a variety of settings and be of benefit to them. And the last project I wanted to touch on was connecting Killinghall community. So hopefully you can see that slide now. My question to you would be, this church in Killinghall near Harrogate has been decarbonised. From the photo, can you tell? So here we have a decarbonisation has been done as part of the general refurbishment with new kitchen and new facilities. And the project includes insulation, solar panels, heat pumps and an EV charger. It's been done in partnership with a community cafe who will now be able to use the building, and they work with food waste, turning it into something very tasty for anybody, including those who can't or aren't able to pay. So Resurrected Bites are going to be based in Killinghall, and so I'm going to tell you on the next slide that that open day for Killinghall is on next Sunday, the 23rd of April. So if you find yourself wanting to learn a little bit more about what a decarbonised building looks like, come along to Killinghall next Sunday. Open 3 till 5. And the last thing to say is in May, we're going to be having our net zero officer in post. Tim O'Brien, whose picture and email address hopefully you can see here, will be taking forward net zero across the district, and that's with thanks to Benefact Trust. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Geoff, because I think I've run over my time, but thank you.
Hello everyone. I appreciate lunchtime is coming up and you're probably starving, so I'll try not to overrun too much. First of all, thanks to Adele and Simon and the organisers for the invitation to speak here today. As Simon explained, it's a huge challenge we're facing, and if you think nationally, globally, I won't say the words that you could say, but you think we've got problems. It's very daunting, but I think each of us can play our part. And I'm delighted that the Methodist Church are taking a leading role in this. We've been working with Adele and the district now for 2 years, starting with Pathways to Net Zero, our sort of term for feasibility studies, on 21 churches. And it's great now that Adele's raising the funds, we can actually start implementing measures and see a difference, particularly on sunny days like this where all the solar panels are happily generating green electricity. Can we have slide 2, please? Just a little bit about D3 Associates, for those that, presumably most of you that are aware who we are. We're a consultancy based up in Northumberland, but we work throughout the country. We're a mixture of architects and engineers, project managers, and we feel that we're ideally suited to work with decarbonisation projects because you need people with different areas of expertise. You need the architects to look at the building fabric. You need mechanical engineers to look at heating systems, electrical engineers to look at lighting, renewable engineers to look at your PV battery storage. And so, yeah, any questions on those areas, we're downstairs with a stand, happily talk to you about your church if you'd like to discuss it further. Moving on to quickly what I'll cover today. We developed really for sort of the community, the schools, the churches that we work with, sort of 7 steps of decarbonisation, just to try and break it down into sort of hopefully manageable chunks, just to be able to understand the process that we go through when we're looking at a church building or any building. I'll then cover the typical stages of how we work, which is sort of a project arrow from start to completion. And finally, I'll use Silverby Methodist Church as an example, because they're well on the way into the process of achieving net zero. Next slide, please. Hopefully we're on step 1. The first 3 steps to the 7 steps are mainly about gathering information of your existing church. It's important we get a good baseline understanding of the building fabric, the energy systems, how you use the building, when it's occupied, the activities that you have. So step 1 is for yourselves to look around your church and see, what's using energy. Primarily, of course, this is your heating system, will probably be your highest energy use, whether it's a gas boiler, oil, LPG, or you may be all electric already. We then look at the thermal properties of the building fabric, because ultimately if you're heating the building and that's your highest energy use, heat is lost that you have to continually replace. So that's a main area of interest for us. As I mentioned, how you use your church, the times of use, activities. Obviously heating, I've mentioned, hot water provision. Churches don't usually have a lot unless you're busy doing lunches. I was at Rayfield Drive Church yesterday in Scarborough. They typically do lunches for 60, 65 people, which is a fantastic service. Of course, that generates a lot of dirty dishes. So hot water provision is quite key there. When you're moving on to purely electricity, lighting, high use for a church, and also cooking, as I've mentioned. Cooling, not so much. You might get a more modern church with cooling facilities. But we also need to know how your heating is controlled. Is it manual? Have you got a programmable timer? The example here I've shown is Brough Methodist Church. It's slightly different and it's got 2 gas boilers feeding different areas. So it's all about understanding which is serving each area, how they're controlled, make sure there are no clashes. So one's heating a different area when it's empty and so on. It's a fantastic, busy community church. When we visited, there was a play group on that's there 5 days a week. There was a mother and toddler activity in the sanctuary because they've removed their pews for a multifunctional space. And it was just a fantastic, busy church. You can also see from the photo they've got solar panels on the church. So you also, if you've got those, need to identify generation. And particularly whether it's working or not. In this case, it wasn't, unfortunately. So that's something I'll come to right at the end, is monitoring when you've done all these implementations of how things are working to make sure they are. And the next slide, step 2. So to establish your current carbon footprint, as part of this baseline assessment, we need to know what your annual consumption is, ideally over 3 years, so we can get a good understanding. Of course, COVID has affected the use of churches, as with all buildings. So it's ideally to have some a year before COVID. Though we're now sort of well past it, so hopefully a year up and full running again, so we can have sort of current energy use. Patchington here, sort of rural church, so they're off the gas grid, so they use heating oil. And during combustion, that's got higher carbon emissions than gas. So they're ones that we sort of do need to prioritise in a decarbonisation project. Moving on to step 3, please. So as mentioned, when you look at heating of a church, we need to discover the heat, where the heat loss is, along with other areas of energy wastage. And for older church drafts are probably the key thing here, as I'm sure you're aware. Durham University did quite an extensive study recently where they modelled some of the older traditional churches, and it turns out that 40% of the heat loss was drafts. And that's something you can all do something about. But we also look at floors, walls, windows, particularly single glazed, because they can have sort of 4 times the heat loss from a modern double glazed unit. Doors. Inadequate heating controls can be a little bit of an issue, so heating's on when it's not needed, or the temperature's getting too high because someone's turned the thermostat up. It's a common issue, as I'm sure you're aware. Leaving lighting on when it doesn't need to be on. And if you haven't switched to LED, obviously that's an area of high energy wastage if you're using older fluorescent type fittings. They are high energy users. So the next step, step 4. So once we've got all the information from yourself, we can now look at, right, what can we do about it to reduce your energy use first of all? So before we get on to replacing heating and putting solar panels on, we just want to simply reduce your energy demand. As I mentioned there, drafts are a key thing, so it's simply going around your church. On a cold, windy day, that's ideal. Checking windows, doors, cable, duct entry points. And if you've got someone who's a competent DIYer, they can probably seal most of those themselves with sort of low-cost materials. Obviously, when you get to pitch ceilings, it gets a bit more challenging. But above that, if you have a flat roof, there's often a ceiling void that may have some, occasionally no insulation in. As heat rises, that's the way to start in terms of reducing the heat loss there through the roof. When we're looking at buildings, we do deem what's appropriate. There's lots of things you can do. As Adele mentioned, for those churches like Killinghall that are doing a major refurbishment, you can introduce more measures. It's more cost effective to do if you've got a builder on site. You may look at lining the walls internally, you may look at the floor, but for most of you that aren't doing that major refurbishment, it's keeping things that are appropriate. Windows are a little bit of a challenge, particularly for those with stained glass windows, lovely as they are. They tend to be rather drafty and let out a lot of heat. Options there are secondary glazing, and there are some good solutions out there for you to sort of reduce the heat loss through those windows. Of course, making sure that primary window is sound to start with. You don't want to put secondary glazing up and find that there's dust and all sorts coming in. Lighting I've mentioned, energy efficiency appliances are the other things. If you're replacing a fridge or freezer, for example, it's trying to get one with a better rating on the sticker on the side of it. Once we've looked at the energy savings, we move on to step 5, the next slide, which is to consider alternative forms of low carbon heating. Ultimately, we're trying to move away from burning fossil fuels. So getting rid of the gas and the oil-fired boilers, the LPG boilers, and moving on to electrifying heat. And it can be either in direct forms of heat. There are such things as under pew heaters, infrared heaters, but ideally, particularly for those spaces that are used a lot more, it's looking at heat pumps. Now, I've got a note here saying explain heat pumps.
You've got 2 minutes
I've got 2 minutes left. Right. If you want to know more about heat pumps, come and see us downstairs, please. Essentially, they're a more efficient way of generating heat. Direct heating, it's 1 kilowatt electricity in, 1 kilowatt of heat out. With a heat pump, you've got 1 kilowatt electricity in, but you might get 3 kilowatts of heat out. So that's why the focus is on heat pumps. And there are different alternative heat sources, but principally we are looking at air source. But if your gas boiler is fairly new, there is a halfway house where you can install a heat pump to do those winter days where it's, say, above 60 degrees. And the heat pump will work quite efficiently to provide heating for your church in those days. And then the gas or the oil boiler can kick in and do the colder days. And then obviously when your gas or your oil-fired boiler fails, then you can go to sort of pure heat pump solution. North Allerton here was a great church to work with, as there's 4 separate areas. So it was a different solution for each part of the church. And a great way, the church hall was obviously the busiest part of the building, well used. It had a high ceiling. A simple solution there is just to install a suspended ceiling, reduce the volume of the air that you need to heat. And in doing that, you can add, it has acoustic benefits, thermal benefits. You can introduce LED lighting. So there's lots of other benefits that can go with that. Now, if we've done the energy saving measures, we've electrified your heating, now it's beneficial to generate your own electricity. Particularly now with the way energy prices are, the more you can generate, the lower your bills will be. And if you can add battery storage as well, that means more electricity generated is used within the building. So keeping your bills down further. Yes, you can consider hydro, wind, but they're generally not appropriate for churches unless you've got lots of land in a rural location and friendly neighbours, because lots of people don't like wind turbines. Moving on to step 5. So the final step is there we calculated all the capital costs, take into account project management, professional statutory fees and VAT. Always remember VAT. That's right, Adele, isn't it? And then we try and work out what the estimated future energy use for the building will be, so we can work out future costs. And that gives you something to work to. So as I mentioned before with Rough, it's then about monitoring the measures once they've been installed to make sure everything's worked as it should be. So moving on from the 7 steps of decarbonation, the next slide is just how we work. So very quickly, there is sort of a process to a project. You can't always do it sort of a smooth transition. It depends on obviously where the funding comes in. We do start obviously with a free consultation with anyone to get a good understanding of what your needs, what your aims are and ambitions. The feasibility study is key to get that plan in place so you know what your ultimate aim is and how you're going to achieve it. You may not do it all at once. You may do it in little bits, do energy saving measures first, then your PV. All I always say is don't do your heat pump first, because your bills will go through the roof and you'll just end up switching it off. The planning stage is heat pumps mostly do need planning permission, so you need to bear that in mind with a project. You may also need to contact your district network operator, which is Northern Power Grid here, particularly if you're putting a large solar array in or large heat pumps. That is part of the process to go through as well. Before you can get to the realisation stage, which for us is doing the detailed design and then going for the procurement of a contractor. During delivery stage, well, through all the process really, expect hiccups. It's very rare for us to find a project goes smoothly, but hopefully you've got a good team with you in terms of yourselves as the client for us as maybe project managers and designers, and a good contractor that working together you can overcome any hurdles that do present themselves. Finally, on to Sewerby Methodist Church as the example. So we started with a pathway to net zero. Adele then identified funding that they could get for the church to achieve that. As you can see, it's not sort of your typical 19th century church building, more of a modern domestic type construction. I think it was 1960s. But there are energy terms of energy saving measures. It was the type of ceiling, just a loft there, where they could install more loft insulation. Excuse me. So really we were focusing about an alternative heating solution. They had electric heating, but it was night storage heaters, expensive to run, even though they had a nighttime tariff. So by switching to heat pumps, we can essentially reduce their energy demand to a third. They've got brilliant roofs for solar PV, facing the right direction, good pitch, good condition, and they have sufficient areas where we've put enough panels on for them to be what we term as net zero. Here, just what I term net zero as, and we do, is operational net zero. So over the course of a year, they'll generate as much electricity as they use. Of course, during the summer months, they'll be generating more than they need, and during winter, they'll have to import. But taking an average over all the year, it will be net zero. Now, we've got a quick little video to play about the installation. It was interesting because it was 3 weeks ago, and that was when you had the sleet and the snow, and the guys are on the roof. Chris Garvey here, he's here from Building Renewables, who are downstairs with us in the stand. Their guys were fantastic. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't very pleasant, and I was just sitting in my car, so whilst they were working on the roof. But hopefully you can see, to start with, they install the rails on the roof. For Pannels, it's quite an easy roof. Slates are a little bit trickier. The panels go on very quick. Unfortunately, when the drone came along, we just had one roof finished. There was another roof done afterwards. But there's an image where you can see the snow on the ground. And if you look carefully from the aerial view, there's a flat bit of roof between the two different pitches. And that's where we're going to install the heat pumps. Hopefully we'll get planning for approval next week for those. So they'll be installed next month. So come next winter, it'll all be working hopefully very well. They'll be able to keep a close eye through apps that you get on the phone of what's being generated, what the batteries, how they're performing, and also get the heat pump settings right. Can you let them know when it's finished? Is that finished now? Right. Right, thank you very much. Sorry we've overrun a bit, but as you can imagine, it's such a broad area, energy. You know, we don't obviously touch about electric cars and other aspects to it, but hopefully you found it interesting. As you say, we're all downstairs, so any more questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Geoff. That's great. No, so we're slightly over. I'm just aware that some of you probably have young people to go and collect. But for those of you who don't and want, to ask any questions now, we're more than happy to stay around for 10 minutes or so. And as I say, we'll make ourselves easy to find downstairs as well. So, yeah, if you wish to stay a little longer and ask questions either openly or come and have a chat separately, that's absolutely fine. For those of you who need to whiz off, that's fully understood as well. Thank you very much for your attention.